morning. It's Sunday, April the 11th, the first Sunday after Easter. Although when you think about it, every Sunday is a little Easter, as it is often called, an opportunity for us to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. But it's good for us to think about Easter for a prolonged season. And in fact, Easter is a season of 50 days. So it's an appropriate time for us to think about how the resurrection of Jesus impacts our lives very personally and very significantly. We're going to be thinking about that today and for the next number of weeks. Today, I'd like us to think about how Jesus interacted with the disciple Peter. This is after his resurrection, of course, and Jesus is with the other disciples on a beach, as we read in John 21. But he has something specific to talk to Peter about, and it's incredible, as we will discover again today. The title of my message today is The God of Second Chances. It's a good title, I think, because as these words from John 21, verses 15 through 19 indicate, Jesus wants to rehabilitate Peter, to restore him and recommission him as a disciple. So after Jesus has been with all of the disciples, he has these words specifically to say to Peter. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Those words indicate how striking it is to see how the gospel ends. You know, there's something significant about endings, whether that has to do with a book, a play, or a movie that you watch. Endings are supposed to bring everything together. There's supposed to be resolution. All of the threads that are woven through a story come together, or ought to, when the story concludes. Sometimes when you're immersed in an incredible story or film, you don't want it to end. It's just pulled you in, and you just hope that when it ends, as it will, that the ending is satisfying and as good as the whole story has been. Sometimes you hear people express disappointment about a movie they've seen or a book they read. They may say things like, "I really loved that book," or the movie is really good, but I really didn't like the ending. It disappointed me. Well, the gospel is not like that at all. The gospel ends well. To borrow the phrase from William Shakespeare, all's well that ends well. Sometimes when you read a book or watch a film, you know that there's a sequel in the works, because not everything is resolved. There are lots of things left hanging in the balance. But the gospel isn't like that. And we see that very clearly in this section of verses that concludes the Gospel of John. Most of you know how Peter behaved in the final days and hours of Jesus' life. You remember perhaps how he boasted about how strong a disciple he was. In fact, he did this in front of the other disciples when Jesus was with all of them in the upper room. He was telling them about how he would soon be handed over into the hands of people who would beat him and crucify him, kill him. And then he said to his disciples, "All of you will fall away on account of me." And that's when Peter, true to form, jumps in, bold and brash, impetuous and impulsive, to say, "Lord, I will never fall away. Even if all these other disciples desert you, I never will." It's quite something when you think about it. Peter was making bold promises here, elevating himself as a super disciple, far more committed than any of the others were. And when Jesus heard Peter talk like this, he turned to him and said, I tell you, Peter, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Once again, Peter strongly disagrees with Jesus. Even if I must die with you, I will never deny you. Well, we know what happened. Peter did deny having any connection with Jesus 3 times that night. In fact, he was so emphatic about this that he even swore an oath to verify his claim that he had nothing to do with Jesus. He even went so far as to invoke a curse on himself. Very serious business for a God-fearing Jew to do something like that. It was his way of conveying that he was willing to be cursed by God if what he was saying would be shown to be untrue. Peter was so bold and so brash. And yet, when he was given 3 opportunities to back up what he said earlier to Jesus and in the presence of the other disciples, he totally collapsed. In fact, he wasn't even willing to admit that he knew Jesus when he was talking to a servant girl, someone as insignificant as her. Big, strong Peter collapsing in the presence of a teenage slave. If Peter thought he could get away with all of this, he soon found out that was impossible. All it took was one look from Jesus across a courtyard, and Peter knew that what Jesus had predicted was right. And he felt the weight of shame and guilt because he knew that what Jesus said, in fact, came true, and Jesus knew about it. As soon as Jesus was taken away to be tried, scourged, mocked, and crucified, Peter fled into the night, crushed under the weight of what he had just done. He wept inconsolably. That's where Peter left Jesus. But it's not where Jesus left Peter. And that's what makes the ending of John's gospel so good, so powerful, so beautiful. Peter may have run away from Jesus. He may have failed miserably as a disciple. But Jesus wouldn't leave Peter there. He came out to him. Even when Peter was with the other disciples again, he wanted to have a specific conversation with Peter. And there's something so touching about that Jesus had a specific encounter with Peter in mind. Peter would probably never presume to approach Jesus given what he had done. So in grace and kindness, Jesus approaches him. He wants to reassure Peter, to restore him, to rehabilitate him, to recommission him. And I want you to notice that the way Jesus does this in that brief conversation with Peter pulls together a number of different threads that we find earlier in the Gospels. It's what makes the ending of John's Gospel so wonderful. It pulls together a lot of other things that we have discovered earlier. We see that especially in the 3-time denial of Peter, and how Jesus now asks Peter 3 times that simple question, do you love me? Obviously, there's a correspondence between the 3 denials and now the 3 questions. This shows us how, in order for something new to begin, something old needs to be dealt with. A specific chapter needs to be closed, and properly closed, before a new chapter can begin. It's the way all reconciliation works. There has to be truth and reconciliation. The past needs to be dealt with. And we see how Jesus does that in subtle but very clear ways in this conversation with Jesus. Notice how, in addition to the 3 questions that he asks Peter, there's also this. In the first question that Jesus asks Peter, he asks him, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Now that's a little ambiguous. We're not sure exactly what Jesus is getting at. Is he asking Peter, do you love me more than you love the disciples? Some suggest he's asking him, Peter, do you love me more than you love these fishing nets? Peter's gone back to his former way of life, and some think that Jesus is asking Peter, do you love me more than this old way of life that you're going back to? I think there's another option, And it's the really insightful option when you think about it. When Peter is asked by Jesus, do you love me more than these? I think Jesus is really asking him, Peter, do you love me more than these other disciples love me? The question can be read that way too. It calls to mind again how Peter boldly boasted of his faith. Even if all these other disciples abandon you, I never will. I love you more than they do, is basically what he was saying. And now Jesus comes to him and says, Peter, really, is that true? Do you really love me more than these other disciples love me? And then consider this as well. It's the fact that Jesus refers to Peter as Simon, son of John, in all three questions. Now, that might not seem that significant. That was his name. But it's the way that Jesus refers to him as Simon, son of John, that's really intriguing. The only other time in John's gospel where Peter is called Simon is way back in chapter 1. You can see again how threads are coming together here. This is when Jesus first called Peter to be one of his disciples. In fact, no sooner does Jesus call Simon to follow him in John chapter 1, and Jesus immediately changes his name. John 1 verse 42, you are Simon, son of John, but you will be called Cephas. It's the Aramaic name for Peter. And both in Aramaic, Cephas, and Peter in Greek both mean rock. And so Peter is given a new identity when he is called to follow Jesus way back in chapter 1. And from that point on in John's gospel, Peter is never called Simon again, except here at the very end. You get a sense that Peter is indeed getting a second chance, a second calling. Jesus is inviting Peter to follow him all over again. And in fact, that's what Jesus says in verse 19, as he said way back in chapter 1, follow me. This truly is the God of second chances. And in order for Peter to be rehabilitated as a disciple, the past needs to be acknowledged. Jesus subtly does that, but in a way that Peter certainly understood what was happening. It's no doubt why he felt hurt by the fact that Jesus asked him 3 times, do you love me? He got where Jesus was going with all of this. And yet, he also knew not only that he has failed as a disciple, that he was a miserable sinner, he knew that Jesus was reaching out to him with love and grace. There is a new beginning always with the God of second chances. He knows that he's forgiven, restored, called once again to follow Jesus. I love this quote attributed to Oscar Wilde. It's one that I think should be put on many church signs on a regular basis. Every saint has a past, and every sinner has a future. That really gets at how God is really a God of second chances. Every saint has a past, Peter certainly knew that, but every sinner has a future. And I want you to know that what was true for Peter is also true for you. That Jesus comes out to you and to every person to meet them exactly where they are. He wants to meet us in our sin, in our shame, in our sense of unworthiness. Sometimes we think that the past has enslaved us and there are things we've done that can never be undone. We think that there is no future for us as far as God is concerned. But these words in John 21 show us so clearly and so beautifully that that's not true. Jesus wants to have a relationship with you in spite of who you are or what you have done. He wants to talk to you about your sin, but never in such a way that makes you feel unloved, unaccepted, abandoned. No, he wants to talk more with us about his love than he wants to talk to us about all the ways we fail to love him. In the presence of Jesus, we will always feel inadequate, guilty, ashamed, and unworthy. But that's never how Jesus wants to leave us. He wants us to know that he loves us, that he died for all those sins that we know so well. He wants us to know that we don't need to feel burdened by a past that we cannot change, because he's dealt with that. He took that past, all our sins, to his cross. The only thing Jesus is interested in knowing about when we encounter him, as we still do today, is that we love him. That's the only question he asks Peter. He doesn't berate him. He doesn't judge him or get angry with him. He doesn't say to Peter, it's over between us. What you did is unforgivable. He says nothing of the kind to him or to anyone. All he wanted to know from Peter is whether he loved him. And that's all he really wants to know about us and the way we have a relationship or a prospective, possible relationship with him. It's what makes the gospel so great. When we follow Jesus, when we hear his call to us, inviting us, even us, to follow him, our yes to that call is our way of answering the most important question anyone will ever ask. The question Jesus puts to us still today: do you love me? Our yes to that question invites us to a new life, a new beginning, following the God of second chances. Not only the God of second chances, but the God of infinite chances. He will always come back to us and give us new opportunities to follow him, acknowledging our mistakes, of course, repenting, doing the best we can to be obedient, following the example of Jesus, who did it perfectly, but knowing that we'll never get it right, and we don't need to, because he's already done that for us. I hope that's how you answer the question that Jesus puts to you when he asks you, do you love me? Just say yes. That's all he wants to hear. And when you say that yes, and when you live out that yes, your life will never be the same. All the threads of your life from beginning to end get woven together in a beautiful way. All of the unresolved tensions may not completely get resolved in a sense that we never have to deal with any struggles or pains anymore. We will. But when we have Jesus in our life and at the center of our life, the greatest issue that we will ever have to address has been dealt with by him who invites us to live in discipleship with him. You can look at it this way. In spite of the great way that the Gospel of John ends, pulling together all of these threads, there is something ongoing about that gospel story. It does suggest a sequel, like many good books or movies do. The sequel is the story of your life and mine, because Jesus continues to meet us exactly where we are and ask us that same question: do you love me? The gospel is a story that continues to be told in the lives of faithful men and women and children in every place and every age who hear that call of Jesus. Do you love me? Yes. Follow me. Let that be the pattern of your life. And I hope that as you even hear the words of this message, you hear the words of Jesus calling out to you. He wants to meet you, to change you, to recommission you. No matter how many times you have failed, he invites you to follow him. Thanks so much for watching this message. I hope that it has given you hope and assurance, especially in this season of Easter. It's a season where we indeed celebrate new beginnings, new opportunities, the grace that is ours because we love a God and are loved by a God of second chances. Thanks be to God. I look forward to sharing more messages with you in the near future. In the meantime, be well and be blessed.